Chapter 1. The Man Called Maximum. John. The alarm clock rang at 5:30 in the morning, as it did every weekday in the Wood household. John Howard Wood Jr. reached over and silenced it with practiced efficiency, careful not to disturb his wife, Mary Ellen, who still slept peacefully beside him. At 63 years old, the judge maintained the disciplined routine he'd developed over 4 decades of legal practice: early rising, morning exercise, a substantial breakfast, and arrival at the courthouse before most of his staff. Consistency, he believed, was the foundation of both good health and good jurisprudence. He moved quietly through the darkened bedroom of their Phoenix condominium, gathering his clothes and carrying them to the bathroom. The Chateau Dijon complex was upscale, but not ostentatious, exactly the kind of residence that suited a federal judge: professional, respectable, comfortable, but not extravagant. John Wood had never sought wealth or luxury. He'd sought something he considered far more valuable: the opportunity to serve justice, to apply the law fairly and firmly, to make a difference in the ongoing battle against the criminal elements that threatened American society. As he showered and dressed, Wood's mind was already on the day ahead. Thursday, May 29th, 1980. The docket was full, as always, but one case stood above all the others in significance: United States versus James Charles Chagra. The trial had been postponed 3 times already due to various defense motions and procedural complications. Today, finally, jury selection would begin. Within a few weeks, Wood would be presiding over one of the most important drug trafficking cases in the history of the Western District of Texas. James Chagra wasn't just another dealer. Wood had reviewed the case file extensively, and he understood exactly who and what he was dealing with. Chagra was a major trafficker, someone who'd built a multi-million-dollar empire smuggling marijuana across the Mexican border. More than that, Chagra was arrogant, flamboyant, someone who flaunted his illegal wealth in Las Vegas casinos and expensive nightclubs, someone who seemed to believe that money placed him above the law, that clever attorneys could get him out of any trouble, that the justice system was just another game to be played and won. Judge Wood intended to teach him otherwise. He knotted his tie, conservative, dark blue, and examined himself in the mirror. The face that looked back was weathered but strong, with deep-set eyes that had witnessed thousands of hours of testimony, hundreds of trials, countless attempts by criminals to evade responsibility for their actions. His hair had gone completely white years ago, which some of his colleagues joked gave him the appearance of a stern grandfather. The defendants who appeared before him rarely found anything grandfatherly in his demeanor. Maximum John, the nickname had emerged sometime in the mid-1970s, whispered first in defense attorney conferences, then spoken more openly in courtrooms and legal publications. Judge Wood handed down the maximum sentences allowable under federal sentencing guidelines, particularly in narcotics cases. He made no apologies for it. The drug epidemic was destroying communities across America. Marijuana, heroin, cocaine, these substances were tearing families apart, fueling violent crime, corrupting law enforcement, and enriching cartels that operated with total disregard for human life. Some of his colleagues on the federal bench preferred more lenient approaches, believing in rehabilitation over punishment, second chances over harsh deterrence. Wood respected their viewpoints but disagreed fundamentally. In his experience, drug traffickers, real traffickers, not small-time users, responded only to the certainty of severe consequences. Show them mercy, and they interpreted it as weakness. Give them light sentences, and they returned to their criminal enterprises the moment they left prison. The only language they truly understood was power, and the law's power resided in its willingness to impose serious punishment. By 6:15, he was dressed and ready for breakfast. Mary Ellen had risen and was already in the kitchen, preparing coffee and toast. They'd been married for 38 years, having met when John was a young attorney, and Mary Ellen was teaching at an elementary school in San Antonio. She'd supported every step of his career, from private practice to district attorney to federal prosecutor, to his appointment to the bench in 1970. She understood the demands of his position, the long hours, the emotional weight of the cases he handled. "Big day," she said, pouring his coffee. "The Chagra trial finally begins. Jury selection begins," Wood corrected gently. "The trial itself is still weeks away. But yes, it's significant. This is exactly the kind of case that demonstrates why we need strong enforcement of narcotics laws." Mary Ellen smiled, but said nothing. She'd heard this speech before, in various forms. throughout their marriage. John's dedication to justice was absolute, sometimes to the point of inflexibility. She admired his principles while occasionally worrying about his intensity. He took the cases personally, felt responsible not just for applying the law, but for protecting society from those who would prey upon it. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence, interrupted only by the morning news on the radio. Reports of inflation, the ongoing hostage crisis in Iran, President Carter's re-election campaign, tensions with the Soviet Union. The world seemed perpetually on edge in 1980, Wood reflected. The optimism of earlier decades had given way to anxiety about America's direction, its power, its ability to solve the problems facing it. Perhaps that was why his approach to criminal justice resonated with so many people. In a world that felt increasingly chaotic, the law offered structure, order, consequences. At 7:15, he kissed Mary Ellen goodbye and gathered his briefcase. The leather case was worn from years of use, stuffed with legal documents, case files, and a novel he was reading during lunch breaks. He believed in staying current with literature, maintaining interests beyond the law, keeping his mind sharp through diverse reading. Currently, he was working through a biography of Theodore Roosevelt, a president he admired for his vigorous approach to leadership and reform. "I'll be home by 6:30, he told his wife, "unless something unexpected comes up." "Be careful," Mary Ellen said, a standard farewell that had become almost ritualistic over the years. Wood smiled. "Always am." He stepped out the front door of their ground-floor condominium into the pleasant morning air. Phoenix in late May was warm, but not yet unbearably hot, the desert sun still gentle at this early hour. The parking lot was quiet, most residents still asleep or preparing for their own days. Wood's brown sedan, a Ford LTD, practical and reliable, sat in his designated space approximately 40 feet from the front door. He'd owned the car for 3 years and had no plans to replace it. Flashy vehicles didn't interest him. As he walked toward the car, he mentally reviewed the questions he intended to ask potential jurors. Jury selection was an art form, identifying people who could be fair and impartial while also being strong enough to handle the evidence in a major criminal case. Drug trials could last weeks, presenting testimony from dozens of witnesses, introducing hundreds of exhibits. The jurors needed stamina, attention to detail, and the ability to follow complex legal arguments. John Wood never saw the man watching him through a rifle scope from the hillside 200 yards away. He never heard the crack of the high-powered rifle as it fired. The bullet struck him in the back with devastating force, tearing through his spine, his lungs, his heart. He fell forward, his briefcase flying from his hand, documents scattering across the asphalt. His body collapsed beside the driver's side door of his sedan. Blood began to pool beneath him, dark and spreading. The judge died within seconds, his life ending in the parking lot of the Chateau Dijon condominium complex, 40 feet from the home where his wife was clearing breakfast dishes, on the morning he was supposed to begin the trial of James Chagra. The assassination of Judge John Howard Wood Jr. was complete. Chapter 2. The First Hours. Patricia Reynolds was pouring her second cup of coffee when she heard what sounded like a car backfiring. The sound was sharp and distinctive, echoing across the condominium complex. She glanced out her kitchen window reflexively, not expecting to see anything significant. What she saw instead made her drop her coffee mug, which shattered on the tile floor. A man was lying in the parking lot, not moving, not getting up, just lying there in an unnatural position, his arm extended, papers scattered around him. Even from her second-floor window, Patricia could see the dark stain spreading beneath the body. She screamed, fumbled for her phone, and dialed 0 for the operator with trembling fingers. "There's been a shooting," she gasped when the operator answered. "Chateau Dijon condominiums, 5200 North Central Avenue. Someone's been shot. Oh God, I think he's dead. Please send someone immediately." The operator's voice was calm and professional, asking for details, keeping Patricia on the line while dispatching emergency services. Police units and an ambulance were rolling within 90 seconds. But even as they raced toward the scene, Patricia Reynolds had a terrible suspicion about the identity of the man in the parking lot. She'd seen him many mornings, walking to his car at roughly the same time, always dressed formally, always carrying a briefcase. The federal judge who lived 2 units away from her own apartment. Phoenix police officer Daniel Martinez arrived first, his patrol car skidding to a halt near the entrance to the complex. He was 28 years old, a 5-year veteran of the department, and he'd responded to countless calls during his career. But as he approached the body in the parking lot, training and experience battling against the sheer surreality of what he was seeing, Martinez understood immediately that this was unlike anything he'd encountered before. The man was clearly dead. The amount of blood, the stillness, the position of the body, all indicated that life had left rapidly and violently. Martinez secured the scene, unrolling yellow police tape, radioing for backup, and beginning the process of documenting everything he observed. More officers arrived, then paramedics who confirmed what everyone already knew, then detectives from the homicide division, summoned because this was clearly a murder, not an accident or natural death. Detective Sarah Hoffman took charge of the scene. She was 42 years old, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, and one of the most experienced homicide investigators in Phoenix. She'd worked hundreds of murder cases, from domestic violence to gang shootings to contract killings. But when one of the responding officers showed her the wallet recovered from the victim's pocket, revealing his identity, Hoffman felt a chill run down her spine. John Howard Wood, Jr., federal judge. This wasn't just a murder. This was a political assassination, a direct attack on the justice system itself. Hoffman immediately called her captain, who called the chief of police, who called the mayor and the FBI field office simultaneously. Within an hour of the shooting, the case had escalated to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Mary Ellen Wood heard the sirens, but didn't initially connect them to her husband. She was washing the breakfast dishes, thinking about her plans for the day, grocery shopping, a meeting with her book club, dinner preparation. The knock on her door came at 7:58, just 43 minutes after John had left for work, when she opened it and saw two uniformed police officers standing there, their faces grave. She knew immediately that something terrible had happened. "Mrs. Wood? Mrs. Mary Ellen Wood?" "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Ma'am, may we come in? We need to speak with you about your husband." She led them to the living room, her legs feeling weak, her heart pounding. The officers sat down, and the older one, whose nameplate read Sergeant Morrison, spoke with careful gentleness. "Mrs. Wood, I'm very sorry to inform you that your husband has been killed. He was shot in the parking lot approximately 1 hour ago. Emergency services responded, but he died almost immediately. There was nothing anyone could do." The words didn't seem real. Mary Ellen stared at the officer, trying to process information that her brain refused to accept. John was dead? Shot? In their parking lot? It was impossible. He'd just left for work. She'd just said goodbye to him. This couldn't be happening. "Who?" she managed to ask. "Who did this?" "We don't know yet, ma'am, but I assure you, every resource available will be devoted to finding the person responsible." Mary Ellen Wood collapsed into tears, and the officers sat with her, offering what comfort they could, while the world she'd known for 38 years shattered around her. By 9 o'clock that morning, the parking lot of the Chateau Dijon was swarming with law enforcement personnel. Phoenix police, FBI agents, evidence technicians, medical examiners, supervisors from multiple agencies. The entire complex had been sealed off, residents asked to remain in their units while investigators processed the scene. News crews arrived and were kept at a distance, their cameras capturing footage of the police tape, the covered body, the obvious intensity of the investigation. Special Agent Robert Mitchell of the FBI arrived at 9:20. He was 47 years old, a 20-year veteran of the Bureau, currently assigned to the Phoenix field office as supervisor of the Major Crimes Unit. Mitchell had worked bank robberies, kidnappings, public corruption cases, and organized crime investigations. He'd never worked the assassination of a federal judge because, in the history of the United States, no federal judge had ever been assassinated, until now. Mitchell conferred with Detective Hoffman, and they walked the scene together, reconstructing what had happened. The angle of entry suggested the shot had come from an elevated position at significant distance. They scanned the surrounding area and identified a hillside approximately 200 yards northwest of the parking lot. A team of agents and officers moved toward it immediately. "This wasn't some random shooting," Hoffman said. "This was planned, professional." "Agreed," Mitchell replied. "The question is who planned it and why. A federal judge makes enemies. We'll need to review every case Judge Wood presided over, every sentence he handed down, everyone who might have harbored enough resentment to do this. That could be hundreds of people. Then we'll investigate hundreds of people. We don't have a choice." On the hillside, agents found what they were looking for, a shell casing, partially concealed in desert scrub. The brass cartridge was photographed in place, then carefully collected and bagged as evidence. Ballistics experts would examine it, determine the caliber and type of weapon used, possibly even identify the specific firearm if it had been used in other crimes or was later recovered. The news of Judge Wood's assassination spread rapidly. By midday, it was the lead story on every television network and radio station in the country. Federal judges across the nation received immediate security details from the U.S. Marshals Service. Courthouses went on heightened alert. The Department of Justice in Washington issued a statement expressing outrage and promising a comprehensive investigation. Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti held a press conference at 2:00 Eastern Time. Standing before a wall of American flags, his expression stern and uncompromising, he addressed the nation. This morning, a federal judge was murdered in Phoenix, Arizona. Judge John Wood was a dedicated public servant who devoted his life to upholding the law and protecting our communities. His assassination represents not just an attack on one man, but an assault on the entire American system of justice. Make no mistake, we will find those responsible. We will prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law, and we will demonstrate that terrorism, and that is precisely what this is, an act of terrorism against the judicial system, will not be tolerated in the United States of America. The words were strong, the commitment clear, but behind the scenes, investigators understood the enormous challenge they faced. Federal judges handle controversial cases. They make decisions that anger criminals, civil litigants, corporations, and advocacy groups. Judge Wood, with his reputation for harsh sentencing in drug cases, had undoubtedly made many enemies. Finding which enemy had acted on their hatred would require painstaking investigation, meticulous analysis, and probably a significant amount of luck. Special Agent Mitchell assembled his task force that afternoon. Agents from multiple FBI field offices, DEA agents with expertise in narcotics investigations, Phoenix police detectives, U.S. Marshals, prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office. The conference room at the FBI field office was crowded, the atmosphere tense, everyone understanding the magnitude of what they were undertaking. "We're calling this Operation Judgment," Mitchell announced. "Our objective is simple: identify, locate, and arrest everyone involved in the murder of Judge Wood. This investigation will be thorough, methodical, and relentless. We're going to examine Judge Wood's entire career, every case he presided over, every defendant he sentenced. We're going to interview witnesses, review financial records, conduct surveillance, and follow every lead no matter where it takes us." He paused, making eye contact with various members of the team. "I know some of you are thinking this is impossible, that we'll never find the killer. I disagree. Whoever did this made mistakes. They always do. Our job is to find those mistakes and exploit them. We're going to work 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, until we have arrests. Questions?" There were no questions. Everyone understood the assignment. The investigation was beginning. Chapter 3. The suspect emerges. While investigators began the massive task of reviewing Judge Wood's career, one name emerged almost immediately as the primary suspect: James Charles Chagra. The timing was too significant to ignore. Chagra's trial was supposed to begin that very morning. Now, with Judge Wood dead, the trial was indefinitely postponed. The motive was clear and compelling. FBI agents descended on El Paso, Texas, where Chagra lived and operated his drug trafficking empire. They interviewed his associates, surveilled his known locations, and began building a comprehensive profile of the man who might have ordered a federal judge's murder. What they discovered was a complex individual who embodied the contradictions of the 1970s drug culture: intelligent but reckless, charming but ruthless, outwardly successful but fundamentally criminal. James Chagra was born on December 25, 1944, in El Paso. His family was Lebanese American, part of a substantial Middle Eastern immigrant community in the border city. His father, Abdallah Chagra, ran a successful import business and raised his children with traditional values, emphasizing education, entrepreneurship, and family loyalty. James, the middle of 3 sons, showed early promise as a student and athlete. He could have been anything. He chose to be a drug dealer. The transformation began in the late 1960s. During Chagra's college years, marijuana use was exploding across American campuses, and Chagra recognized a business opportunity. He began small, buying cannabis in Mexico and reselling it to fellow students. The profits were immediate and substantial. Within a year, he'd dropped out of college to pursue drug trafficking full-time. By the mid-1970s, Chagra was no longer a small-time dealer. He was moving tons of marijuana across the border, utilizing sophisticated smuggling routes, coordinating with Mexican suppliers, and distributing throughout the American Southwest. His organization employed dozens of people: drivers, pilots, warehouse workers, accountants, and enforcers. The money flowed in torrents. Chagra made millions of dollars annually, and he spent it with abandon. Las Vegas became his playground. Casino executives knew him by name, comped him penthouses, and watched as he gambled staggering sums at blackjack tables and roulette wheels. Chagra once lost $300,000 in a single weekend at Caesar's Palace and laughed about it afterward. He wore expensive Italian suits, drove luxury cars, and surrounded himself with beautiful women. To outsiders, he looked like a successful businessman. To those who knew the truth, he was a criminal living a fantasy. But the lifestyle came with consequences. Federal law enforcement agencies had been watching Chagra for years, building cases, gathering evidence. In 1978, DEA agents and FBI investigators finally had enough to move forward. They arrested Chagra on charges of conspiracy to distribute marijuana, a federal offense carrying a potential sentence of 30 years to life. The case was solid, built on wiretaps, cooperating witnesses, and financial records documenting millions in illegal income. The case was assigned to Judge John Wood's court. When Chagra learned this, according to later testimony, he became deeply concerned. Everyone in the criminal defense community knew about Maximum John. Defense attorneys warned their clients that appearing before Wood meant receiving the harshest possible sentence. Chagra, facing decades in federal prison, understood that his lifestyle was over unless he could somehow beat the charges or remove Judge Wood from the case. His attorney, his older brother Lee Chagra, filed numerous motions attempting to get the case transferred to a different judge. The motions argued that Wood's reputation for harsh sentencing created an unfair prejudice against defendants, that Chagra couldn't receive a fair trial before such a notoriously punitive judge. Each motion was denied by the judicial system's rules requiring random case assignment. Lee Chagra was a brilliant attorney, perhaps the best criminal defense lawyer in El Paso. But even he couldn't overcome his client's terrible luck in drawing Maximum John. As the trial date approached, Jimmy Chagra's behavior became increasingly erratic. He drank heavily, gambled even more recklessly, and spoke openly about his fears. Friends later recalled him saying that he couldn't survive 30 years in prison, that he'd rather die than spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell. Others remembered darker comments, vague statements about taking care of the problem and eliminating the obstacle. Investigators focused intensely on the weeks leading up to Judge Wood's murder. They obtained warrants for Chagra's financial records and discovered a pattern of large cash withdrawals. In March 1980, Chagra withdrew $50,000 in cash from a bank account in Las Vegas. In April, another $75,000. The withdrawals continued through May, totaling more than $200,000. Where had the money gone? That became a crucial question. FBI agents interviewed Terry Richards, a mid-level marijuana distributor who worked for Chagra's organization. Richards had been arrested on unrelated charges and was facing significant prison time when prosecutors approached him with an offer: cooperate in the Judge Wood investigation, and his sentence would be substantially reduced. Richards decided to talk. According to Richards, Jimmy Chagra had discussed killing Judge Wood as early as February 1980. During a meeting at a restaurant in El Paso, Chagra had complained bitterly about the upcoming trial. "Maximum John is going to bury me," Chagra had said. "I'm looking at 30 years minimum. I can't do that kind of time. I won't do it." When Richards suggested appealing any conviction, Chagra had shaken his head. "Appeals take years. I'd be an old man before I got out. If I ever got out, the only way to win is to make sure the trial never happens." Richards claimed he'd thought Chagra was just venting frustration. But looking back after the assassination, the comments took on sinister significance. Richards provided additional details. He'd seen Chagra meet with his brother Joe on several occasions, speaking in hushed tones, clearly discussing something they didn't want others to hear. He'd noticed Jimmy becoming more optimistic as the trial date approached, as if he knew something others didn't. The testimony was valuable but not sufficient for a prosecution. Defense attorneys would argue that Richards was a convicted criminal seeking leniency, that his testimony was fabricated or exaggerated to please prosecutors. The investigation needed physical evidence. recorded conversations, or additional witnesses who could corroborate the conspiracy. Agents turned their attention to Joe Chagra, Jimmy's younger brother. Joe was 40 years old, a career criminal with convictions for drug trafficking and illegal gambling. Unlike his brothers Jimmy and Lee, Joe had never achieved wealth or success. He lived on the margins of the drug world, doing odd jobs for various criminal organizations, never quite establishing himself as a major player. But he had connections, knew people in the underworld, and was fiercely loyal to family. Surveillance on Joe Chagra revealed frequent meetings with a man named Charles Harrison. Agents ran Harrison's name through federal databases and found an extensive criminal history: armed robbery, assault, weapons violations. Harrison was 52 years old, a career criminal originally from Texas, someone who'd spent more than half his adult life in prison. He was exactly the kind of person someone might hire for a murder. Investigators pulled Harrison's travel records and discovered something fascinating. In early May 1980, Harrison had purchased airline tickets from Dallas to Phoenix. He'd rented a car at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport on May 15th and returned it on May 30th, one day after Judge Wood's assassination. Credit card records showed Harrison had stayed at a modest motel on the outskirts of Phoenix during that period. The evidence was circumstantial but mounting. Chagra had motive: avoiding Maximum John's courtroom. Chagra had made large cash withdrawals in the months before the murder. Joe Chagra had connections to Charles Harrison. Harrison had been in Phoenix at precisely the right time. None of it proved murder, but together, the facts formed a compelling pattern. Special Agent Mitchell coordinated with Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Brennan to discuss prosecution strategy. Brennan was 38 years old, a graduate of Yale Law School, and one of the most aggressive prosecutors in the Western District of Texas. She'd built her career taking on difficult cases: organized crime, political corruption, major fraud, and winning convictions through meticulous preparation and aggressive courtroom tactics. "We need more," Brennan said, after reviewing the evidence. "What we have now is suggestive, but not conclusive. A good defense attorney will argue coincidence. We need to prove conspiracy. And that requires either recorded conversations, testimony from someone directly involved, or physical evidence linking the defendants to the murder weapon. We're working on all three," Mitchell assured her. "We've got agents reviewing every phone call Chagra made in the last 6 months. We're interviewing everyone who's ever worked for him, and we're still searching for the rifle." The rifle became a key focus of the investigation. Ballistics experts had examined the shell casing recovered from the hillside and determined it came from a Weatherby Mark V, a high-end hunting rifle that fired Magnum cartridges. The weapon was expensive, typically costing between $1,000 and $2,000, and relatively uncommon. The FBI issued bulletins to gun dealers throughout the Southwest, requesting information about anyone who had purchased such a rifle in the past year. Hundreds of tips came in, each requiring investigation. Agents visited gun stores, examined sales records, interviewed purchasers. Most led nowhere: hunters who'd bought the rifles for legitimate purposes, sportsmen who could account for their weapons, collectors who had solid alibis for May 29th. But one lead proved more interesting. A gun dealer in Amarillo, Texas, reported selling a Weatherby Mark V to a man matching Charles Harrison's description in March 1980. The purchaser had paid cash and provided identification that later proved to be false. The dealer had been suspicious at the time, but had no legal reason to refuse the sale. Agents showed the dealer a photo lineup, and he identified Harrison with reasonable certainty as the purchaser. The evidence was building. Harrison had purchased a rifle of the type used to kill Judge Wood. Harrison had been in Phoenix at the time of the murder. Harrison had connections to Joe Chagra, who had connections to Jimmy Chagra, who had motive and had made large cash withdrawals. The chain was forming, link by link, but the rifle itself remained missing. Harrison's motel room in Phoenix had been thoroughly searched after his departure, revealing nothing. His apartment in Dallas had been tossed by federal agents with a warrant, again producing no weapon. Wherever Harrison had disposed of the rifle, possibly in the Arizona desert, possibly disassembled and scattered, it had not been recovered. "We can still make a case without the weapon," Brennan told the task force during a strategy meeting, "but it would be much stronger with it. Keep searching." Chapter 4. The Prison Recordings. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In July 1980, federal authorities arrested Joe Chagra on unrelated charges involving illegal gambling operations. He was held at the Federal Correctional Institution in Texarkana, Texas, pending trial. The FBI saw an opportunity. Special Agent Mitchell arranged for Jerry Thompson, a convicted burglar serving a 5-year sentence at the same facility, to be placed in a cell near Joe Chagra. Thompson was 45 years old, a career criminal who'd been in and out of prison most of his adult life. He'd agreed to cooperate with federal investigators on previous occasions, providing information about fellow inmates in exchange for various benefits: reduced sentences, better prison assignments, protection from enemies. Thompson's assignment was simple: befriend Joe Chagra and try to get him talking about Judge Wood's murder. The FBI equipped Thompson with a small recording device concealed in what appeared to be an ordinary transistor radio. The device could capture conversations within a 15-foot radius, storing them on magnetic tape that could later be retrieved and analyzed. Befriending Joe Chagra proved easier than expected. Inmates form alliances quickly in federal prison, seeking protection, companionship, and assistance navigating the complex social hierarchies of incarceration. Thompson presented himself as an experienced convict who understood the system, someone who could provide advice and support. Joe, isolated from family and facing serious charges, responded to the overture. They spent hours together in the recreation yard, in the cafeteria, in the common areas of their cell block. Thompson was patient, never pushing too hard, allowing the relationship to develop naturally. He complained about law enforcement, about prosecutors, about the injustice of the system. Joe began to open up, sharing his own grievances, his own frustrations. The first significant statement came in August. They were sitting in the yard, watching other inmates play basketball, when Joe mentioned his brother Jimmy's legal troubles. Jimmy couldn't handle what Maximum John was going to do to him, Joe said quietly. That judge, he had no mercy, man. He would have given Jimmy life without thinking twice about it. We had to do something. Thompson's concealed recorder captured every word. What did you do? Thompson asked carefully. Joe became quiet, perhaps sensing he'd said too much. Nothing, just talking. Forget it. But over subsequent weeks, Joe revealed more. The key was patience and the gradual building of trust. Thompson listened sympathetically as Joe complained about the investigation, about federal agents harassing his family, about the pressure being applied to find Judge Wood's killer. They think Jimmy ordered it, Joe said during one conversation. They're wrong. Jimmy talked about it, sure, but he wouldn't have gone through with it on his own. He needed help making it happen. You helped him? Thompson asked. I knew people who could handle problems. That's all I'm saying. The recordings weren't confessions, but they demonstrated guilty knowledge. Joe Chagra clearly knew that his brother had been involved in Judge Wood's murder, and he'd played some role himself, even if he wasn't admitting details. The most damning recording came in September 1980. Joe had received a letter from his wife, who'd written about federal agents questioning her regarding large cash withdrawals from family bank accounts. Joe was angry, complaining to Thompson about government intrusion. They're looking at the money, Joe said, following every dollar. They want to prove we paid someone, which we did, obviously. $250,000 to take care of the problem. But they can't prove where it went. The money was cash, handed off personally, no records. They'll never trace it, Thompson pressed gently. Who got the money? Joe smiled grimly. A professional, someone who knows how to handle sensitive situations. I'm not giving you names, but let's just say the investment was worthwhile. No Maximum John, no maximum sentence. The recording was explosive. Joe Chagra had essentially admitted that he and his brother had paid someone $250,000 to murder Judge Wood. Prosecutors couldn't have asked for better evidence. Meanwhile, additional evidence emerged from a different source. Charles Harrison, while being held on weapons charges in a Dallas jail, made a phone call to his ex-wife. Federal authorities had standing warrants to monitor all calls from inmates suspected of involvement in serious crimes. The recorded conversation was reviewed by FBI agents and immediately flagged as significant. Harrison's ex-wife, Sandra, asked him about the Judge Wood case, which had been all over the news for months. Harrison, apparently believing the call was secure, responded in a way that stunned investigators. I did what I was paid to do, Harrison said. The man had it coming. He'd destroyed too many lives, sent too many people to die in prison. Someone had to stop him. Sandra Harrison was shocked. Are you saying you killed the judge in Phoenix? There was a long pause. Then Harrison spoke carefully, perhaps realizing his mistake. I'm not saying anything specific on this phone, but yeah, I solved someone's problem. Permanently. Oh my God, Charlie. Do you know what you've done? I've done lots of things, Sandra. This is just another one, and I got paid well for it. $250,000. Enough to disappear for a while. Too bad I got picked up on this weapons thing before I could get out of the country. The recording was devastating evidence. Harrison had admitted to killing Judge Wood for money, and he'd mentioned the exact amount that Joe Chagra had referenced in his conversation with Jerry Thompson. The corroboration was nearly perfect. Armed with these recordings, prosecutors moved toward indictments, but they wanted one more element: direct testimony from someone involved in the conspiracy. They found their witness in Terry Richards, the marijuana distributor who'd already provided initial information. Richards had been watching the investigation unfold from federal custody, understanding that the case was building toward major indictments. His attorney advised him that if he wanted maximum benefit from cooperation, he needed to provide everything he knew, not just pieces. Richards decided to fully cooperate. In detailed debriefing sessions with federal agents, Richards described conversations he'd overheard between Jimmy and Joe Chagra. He recalled Jimmy saying, "In March 1980, I need someone reliable who can handle extreme situations. Do you know anyone?" Joe had responded affirmatively. Richards also remembered Joe mentioning, "A guy from Dallas who does contract work," and Jimmy nodding in understanding. Richards provided information about the cash withdrawals, testifying that he'd personally carried $50,000 in cash from Jimmy Chagra to Joe Chagra in early April. He'd been told the money was for taking care of business, but hadn't asked questions. Richards also recalled Jimmy seeming unusually confident as the trial date approached, telling associates, "Don't worry about Maximum John. That situation is being handled." With the recordings from Joe Chagra and Charles Harrison, plus testimony from Terry Richards, prosecutors finally had enough evidence to proceed. A federal grand jury was convened in November 1980 to hear the evidence and consider indictments. Catherine Brennan presented the case methodically over 3 days. She called FBI agents who testified about the investigation. She played the recorded conversations. She presented financial records documenting the cash withdrawals. She called ballistics experts who testified about the rifle used. She brought forward the gun dealer from Amarillo who identified Harrison as the purchaser of the Weatherby Mark V. The grand jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning indictments against 3 defendants. James Charles Chagra, charged with conspiracy to murder a federal judge and continuing criminal enterprise. Joseph Chagra, charged with conspiracy to murder a federal judge and obstruction of justice. And Charles Harrison, charged with murder of a federal judge and conspiracy to commit murder. The arrests were coordinated to occur simultaneously on December 15, 1980. FBI agents took Jimmy Chagra into custody at his home in El Paso, where he was living under house arrest related to his original drug charges. Joe Chagra was arrested at the federal prison in Texarkana. Charles Harrison was already in custody on weapons charges, so agents simply served him with the new indictment. All 3 men were denied bail, designated as flight risks and dangers to the community. They were transported to separate high-security federal detention facilities to await trial. The legal battle was about to begin. Chapter 5. The Trial. The trial of United States versus Chagra and Harrison began on September 14, 1981, in a federal courthouse in Dallas, Texas. The venue had been moved from Phoenix due to extensive pretrial publicity that made finding an impartial jury difficult in Arizona. Judge Marcus Williams, a respected federal jurist with 30 years of experience, presided over the proceedings. Security was extraordinary, with U.S. Marshals stationed throughout the courthouse, metal detectors at every entrance, and plainclothes agents mingling with spectators. Catherine Brennan led the prosecution team, assisted by 2 other federal prosecutors, and supported by FBI agents who'd worked the investigation. The defense fielded an impressive array of legal talent. Jimmy Chagra was represented by Daniel Foster, a renowned criminal defense attorney from Houston, known for aggressive cross-examination and dramatic courtroom tactics. Joe Chagra's attorney was Martin Rodriguez, a veteran El Paso lawyer with extensive experience in federal cases. Charles Harrison's defense was handled by Sarah Montgomery, a Dallas attorney who'd successfully defended numerous high-profile criminal cases. Jury selection took 2 weeks, with attorneys on both sides questioning hundreds of potential jurors. The case had received massive media coverage, making it difficult to find citizens who hadn't formed opinions about the defendant's guilt or innocence. Eventually, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were seated, a mix of ages, backgrounds, and occupations. but all claiming they could fairly evaluate the evidence and render impartial verdicts. Judge Williams addressed the jury on the morning of September 28th, explaining their role and the legal standards they would apply. Then Catherine Brennan stood to deliver the prosecution's opening statement. She spoke for 90 minutes, outlining the case with precision and passion. She described Judge Wood's dedication to justice, his reputation for fairness and firmness, and the fear he inspired in drug traffickers who knew they'd receive no mercy in his courtroom. She explained Jimmy Chagra's predicament, facing decades in prison with no apparent way out except eliminating the judge who would sentence him. She detailed the conspiracy, with Joe Chagra serving as intermediary and Charles Harrison as the hired killer. She promised the jury that the evidence would prove beyond reasonable doubt that all three defendants had conspired to commit one of the most brazen crimes in American history: the assassination of a federal judge. This case is about power, Brennan concluded. The power of drug dealers who believe their wealth places them above the law, the power of killers who believe they can silence justice with violence, and ultimately, the power of our legal system to hold even the most dangerous criminals accountable for their actions. Judge John Wood died because he refused to be intimidated. Your verdict will determine whether his sacrifice means anything. Daniel Foster's opening statement for Jimmy. Chagra took a different approach. He didn't deny that his client was a drug dealer, or that he'd feared Maximum John's courtroom. Instead, Foster argued that talking about killing a judge and actually doing it were vastly different things. Jimmy Chagra is a gambler, a risk-taker, someone who talks big and lives large, Foster told the jury. He said stupid things, vented his frustrations, complained about the judge who was going to sentence him. But talking isn't doing. The prosecution wants you to believe that vague statements made in anger translate to murder. They don't. The evidence will show that Jimmy Chagra, for all his flaws, never ordered anyone to kill Judge Wood. He's guilty of many things, but not this crime. The trial lasted 4 months, with testimony from more than 50 witnesses. The prosecution methodically built its case, presenting evidence in careful sequence. FBI agents described the investigation, tracing the connections between the defendants. Financial experts analyzed the cash withdrawals and money transfers. The gun dealer from Amarillo identified Harrison as the purchaser of the rifle. Ballistics experts explained how the bullet that killed Judge Wood was fired from a Weatherby Mark V. Terry Richards took the stand and testified about conversations he'd overheard between the Chagra brothers. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility viciously, pointing out his extensive criminal history and the benefits he'd received for cooperating. Richards remained calm under cross-examination, acknowledging his past, while insisting his testimony about the Chagras was truthful. "I'm not a good person," Richards admitted. "I've committed crimes. I've hurt people. I've made terrible choices. But that doesn't mean I'm lying now. I heard what I heard, and I'm telling you the truth about it." The most dramatic moments came when prosecutors played the recorded conversations. The courtroom fell silent as Jerry Thompson's recordings of Joe Chagra played through speakers. Jurors leaned forward, listening intently as Joe discussed the money paid to handle problems, and mentioned that no Maximum John meant no maximum sentence. Charles Harrison's phone call to his ex-wife was even more damning. When the recording reached the point where Harrison said, "I did what I was paid to do. I solved someone's problem permanently," several jurors visibly reacted, some shaking their heads, others taking notes furiously. Defense attorneys fought back with everything they had. Daniel Foster argued that Joe Chagra's statements were vague and could be interpreted multiple ways. He suggested that Joe might have been boasting to impress a fellow inmate, exaggerating his role in events he knew nothing about. Foster pointed out that nowhere in the recordings did Joe explicitly say that Jimmy had ordered the murder. Sarah Montgomery, representing Charles Harrison, took a different approach. She argued that her client's statements on the phone were false bravado, attempts to impress his ex-wife with fabricated stories of criminal exploits. Harrison had a history of telling tall tales, Montgomery insisted, and this was just another example. Charles Harrison is a career criminal and a braggart, Montgomery told the jury during cross-examination of FBI agents. He's someone who inflates his importance, who claims credit for things he didn't do. The prosecution wants you to believe everything he said on that phone call. I'm asking you to consider that he was lying, trying to sound more dangerous and important than he actually is. The prosecution countered by calling Sandra Harrison, Charles's ex-wife, as a witness. She testified that her former husband had never been one to make up stories about crimes he didn't commit. In fact, she said. Charles usually downplayed his criminal activities, not exaggerated them. When he admitted something on the phone, it was typically true. Charlie wasn't a bragger, Sandra testified. He was secretive. He didn't talk about the things he did. So when he told me he'd killed Judge Wood, I believed him, because he would never have said it unless it was true. Prosecutors also called Mary Ellen Wood, the judge's widow, though her testimony was primarily to establish the impact of the crime. She spoke eloquently about her husband's dedication to justice, his belief in the law, and the devastating effect his murder had on their family. Several jurors wiped away tears as she described learning of her husband's death. The defense presented its own witnesses, attempting to establish reasonable doubt. Character witnesses testified that Jimmy Chagra, despite his involvement in drug trafficking, was not a violent person, that he'd never been known to threaten or harm anyone. Joe Chagra's attorney called witnesses who suggested the prison recordings were the result of entrapment, that Jerry Thompson had manipulated Joe into making incriminating statements. Charles Harrison did not testify, exercising his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. His attorney argued that forcing Harrison to take the stand would only expose him to damaging cross-examination without providing meaningful assistance to his defense. The jury was instructed not to draw any negative inference from Harrison's decision not to testify, though everyone in the courtroom understood the impact of that absence. Closing arguments began in February 1982. Catherine Brennan spoke for 3 hours, walking the jury through every piece of evidence, connecting each link in the chain of conspiracy. She reminded them of the motive, the opportunity, the financial transfers, the recorded admissions, and the circumstantial evidence placing Harrison in Phoenix at the time of the murder. The defense wants you to believe this is all coincidence, Brennan argued, that Jimmy Chagra just happened to withdraw hundreds of thousands of dollars, that Joe Chagra just happened to discuss money paid to solve problems, that Charles Harrison just happened to buy a rifle matching the murder weapon, and just happened to be in Phoenix when Judge Wood was killed, and just happened to admit on a recorded phone call that he killed the judge. How many coincidences do we need before we recognize truth? She concluded with emotion. Judge Wood died in a parking lot, shot in the back, murdered because he had the courage to stand up to drug dealers and enforce the law. These 3 men, Jimmy Chagra, Joe Chagra, and Charles Harrison, conspired to silence him. They believed that violence could triumph over justice. Your verdict will prove they were wrong. The defense closing arguments emphasized reasonable doubt. Daniel Foster reminded the jury that the prosecution's case relied heavily on cooperating witnesses with criminal histories and motives to lie. He questioned the reliability of the recordings, suggesting they were open to interpretation. He argued that while Jimmy Chagra might be guilty of drug trafficking, that didn't make him a murderer. The government wants you to fill in the gaps in their evidence with speculation, Foster said. They want you to assume that because Jimmy Chagra feared Judge Wood, he must have ordered his murder. That's not proof. That's assumption. And you cannot convict on assumptions. The jury received the case on February 17, 1982. They deliberated for 8 days, reviewing evidence, replaying recordings, and debating among themselves. The length of deliberations worried prosecutors, suggesting disagreement among jurors about the strength of the evidence. But finally, on February 19th, the jury sent word that verdicts had been reached. The courtroom was packed as the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdicts. Judge Williams asked each defendant to stand. In the case of United States versus Charles Harrison, on the charge of murder of a federal judge, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Harrison showed no reaction, his face blank. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder? Guilty. Joe Chagra was next. In the case of United States versus Joseph Chagra, on the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. Joe closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping. Finally, Jimmy Chagra. In the case of United States versus James Charles Chagra, on the charge of conspiracy to murder a federal judge, how do you find? Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Family members of the defendant sobbed. Reporters rushed from the room to call their editors. Judge Williams gavelled for order, threatening to clear the courtroom if people couldn't control themselves. The verdicts were complete. All 3 defendants had been convicted on all charges. Sentencing was scheduled for April 8, 1982. Chapter 6. Consequences and Legacy. The sentencing hearing was held in a courthouse fortified like a military installation. The convictions had generated threats from various criminal organizations. and federal authorities were taking no chances. U.S. Marshals screened everyone entering the building, including the lawyers. Armored vehicles were positioned outside. Sharpshooters were stationed on nearby rooftops. Charles Harrison was brought in first, shackled and wearing an orange prison jumpsuit. He'd lost weight during the months of trial, and his face had aged noticeably. Judge Williams reviewed the pre-sentence report, which detailed Harrison's extensive criminal history, his lack of remorse, and his continued danger to society. "Mr. Harrison," the judge began, "you have been convicted of murdering a federal judge. This is not merely a crime against one individual, but an assault on the foundation of our democratic system. Judge Wood was killed because he had the integrity to enforce the law, without fear of consequences. You took his life for money, demonstrating complete disregard for human life and the rule of law." Judge Williams paused, letting the words sink in. "The court has considered all factors in determining an appropriate sentence. Given the severity of the crime, your criminal history, and your lack of remorse, I am sentencing you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, to be housed in a maximum security facility. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, Mr. Harrison. May God have mercy on your soul." Harrison was led away without speaking. His attorney had advised him to make a statement expressing remorse, but Harrison had refused, maintaining to the end that he'd been wrongly convicted. Joe Chagra was sentenced next. Judge Williams acknowledged that Joe had not pulled the trigger, but emphasized his crucial role in the conspiracy. "Mr. Chagra, you served as the intermediary between your brother and the assassin. Without your participation, this murder might never have occurred. You facilitated communications. You helped arrange payment, and you aided in planning. While you may not have fired the fatal shot, you are nonetheless responsible for Judge Wood's death." Joe received 30 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Finally, Jimmy Chagra stood before the judge. Catherine Brennan had submitted a lengthy sentencing memorandum, arguing for life imprisonment, detailing Chagra's extensive drug trafficking operation and his callous decision to order a murder rather than face justice. Daniel Foster had submitted his own memorandum, emphasizing that Jimmy had not personally killed anyone and asking for leniency. Judge Williams spoke for nearly 20 minutes, reviewing the evidence and explaining his reasoning. He described the corrosive effect of drug trafficking on American society, the violence it spawned, the lives it destroyed. He emphasized that Jimmy Chagra had chosen to solve his legal problems through murder, rather than accepting responsibility for his crimes. "You believed that by killing Judge Wood you could escape the consequences of your actions," Judge Williams said. "You were arrogant enough to think that money could buy you freedom, that violence could overcome justice. You were wrong, Mr. Chagra, completely and utterly wrong." Jimmy Chagra received life imprisonment without parole, plus an additional 30 years for the continuing criminal enterprise conviction. He would die in prison. The sentences were final. No appeals succeeded in overturning the convictions or reducing the punishments. The legal system had spoken with absolute clarity. Murdering a federal judge resulted in the harshest possible consequences. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the 3 convicted men. The assassination prompted massive reforms in judicial security. Federal judges received mandatory threat assessments. Courthouses installed enhanced security systems. U.S. Marshals expanded their protective details. Congress passed legislation increasing penalties for threatening or attacking federal officials, making it clear that the judiciary would be defended with every resource available. The case also impacted how federal trials were conducted in drug cases. Defense attorneys could no longer argue that their clients might face prejudicial treatment before particular judges. The system made clear that attempting to manipulate judge assignments through violence would result in even harsher punishments than defendants would have received originally. Catherine Brennan's career flourished. She was promoted to U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Texas in 1984, becoming one of the first women to hold such a position. She served for 8 years, prosecuting major drug trafficking organizations, white-collar criminals, and public corruption cases. In 1992, she was appointed to the federal bench herself, becoming a judge in the same district where she'd prosecuted the Chagra case. Colleagues said she brought the same intensity and dedication to the bench that she'd shown as a prosecutor. Special Agent Robert Mitchell received the FBI's highest civilian honor, the Director's Award, for his work on the case. He continued to supervise major investigations until his retirement in 1995. In training sessions for new agents, Mitchell often used the Judge Wood case as an example of how persistence and methodical investigation could solve even the most challenging crimes. "We didn't solve it with one brilliant insight," Mitchell would tell trainees. "We solved it by doing the work, interviewing witnesses, reviewing financial records, analyzing evidence, following leads. It took months, and there were times we thought we'd never break it, but we kept working, and eventually, the truth emerged." Mary Ellen Wood lived for another 39 years after her husband's death, passing away in 2019 at the age of 96. She never remarried, dedicating the remainder of her life to honoring John's memory and advocating for judicial security. She testified before Congress on multiple occasions, describing the impact of her husband's assassination and urging legislators to provide adequate protection for federal judges and their families. She also established the John H. Wood Jr. Memorial Scholarship at the University of Texas Law School, providing financial assistance to students interested in pursuing careers as prosecutors or federal judges. The scholarship required recipients to commit to at least 5 years of public service after graduation, ensuring that John's legacy of dedication to justice would continue through future generations of lawyers. In interviews during her later years, Mary Ellen spoke eloquently about her husband's character and principles. She described him as a man of absolute integrity, someone who believed deeply that the law must be applied consistently and fairly, regardless of a defendant's wealth, connections, or willingness to use violence. She acknowledged that some people found his sentencing harsh, but she defended his approach. John believed that drug trafficking was destroying communities, she said in a 2015 interview with a Texas newspaper. He saw families torn apart, children abandoned, violence spreading because of the drug trade. He felt that judges had a responsibility to impose serious consequences, to send a message that trafficking wouldn't be tolerated. Some people disagreed with his philosophy, but no one could question his sincerity or his courage. He wasn't trying to be cruel. He was trying to protect society. The Chagra family's story ended in tragedy for all involved. Lee Chagra, the brilliant defense attorney who had represented his brother Jimmy in the original drug case, was never charged in connection with Judge Wood's murder, but the scandal destroyed his legal career. He was disbarred in 1983 for unrelated ethical violations and spent several years in federal prison on drug charges. He died in 2003, at age 65, his reputation in ruins, his family fractured. Jimmy Chagra spent his final years in the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the federal system's most secure facilities. Fellow inmates described him as withdrawn and depressed, nothing like the flamboyant gambler and drug dealer he'd once been. He rarely received visitors, as most of his former associates had distanced themselves from him. His wife Elizabeth divorced him in 1991, telling friends she couldn't continue living as the wife of a convicted murderer. Chagra developed cancer in 2001 and was transferred to a prison medical facility in North Carolina. He died on July 15, 2002, at age 57. His death certificate listed metastatic lung cancer as the cause, though prison officials noted that he'd essentially stopped fighting for his life months earlier, refusing treatments and losing the will to survive. A small funeral was held in El Paso, attended by a handful of family members. No prominent figures from his former life appeared. The man who'd once gambled hundreds of thousands of dollars in Las Vegas casinos, who'd lived in luxury and commanded a drug trafficking empire, was buried in a modest grave with a simple headstone bearing only his name and dates of birth and death. Joe Chagra served his 30-year sentence in various federal prisons, maintaining good behavior and working in prison libraries and education programs. He earned a college degree through correspondence courses and taught literacy classes to fellow inmates. Prison officials described him as a model prisoner who expressed genuine remorse for his role in Judge Wood's murder. He was released in June 2010 at age 72. His health deteriorated from decades of incarceration. He moved to a small apartment in San Antonio, living on Social Security benefits and occasionally working part-time at a community center. In a rare interview with a local journalist in 2013, Joe spoke about his crimes with evident regret. "I destroyed my own life and helped destroy my brother's," he said quietly. "But worse than that, I participated in killing a good man who was just doing his job. Judge Wood had a family, people who loved him, a career dedicated to justice. I took all that away because I was loyal to my brother and too stupid to realize what we were really doing. I'll carry that guilt until the day I die." Joe Chagra died in 2017 at age 79, living his final years in obscurity, a footnote to one of the most notorious crimes in American legal history. Charles Harrison spent 27 years in federal custody, housed primarily at the Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, known as ADX Florence or Supermax. The facility holds the most dangerous federal prisoners, including terrorists, organized crime leaders, and violent criminals deemed too high risk for standard prisons. Harrison was kept in solitary confinement for most of his incarceration, allowed out of his cell only for showers and occasional recreation in a small enclosed space. Prison psychologists who evaluated Harrison over the years described him as emotionally detached, showing no remorse for Judge Wood's murder or any of his other crimes. He maintained consistently that he'd been wrongly convicted, that the evidence against him was fabricated, that he'd been framed by a justice system seeking a scapegoat. None of his appeals succeeded. No new evidence emerged to support his claims of innocence. Harrison died on December 3, 2007, at age 79. The cause was congestive heart failure. His body was claimed by a distant cousin and cremated without ceremony. No obituary appeared in any newspaper. He simply ceased to exist, remembered only in the context of the crime that defined his life. The case left lasting impacts on the federal judiciary and law enforcement. In the immediate aftermath of the convictions, several other major drug traffickers who'd been preparing to go to trial before notoriously strict judges abandoned their defense strategies and accepted plea bargains. The message was clear. Attempting to intimidate or harm judges would result only in harsher treatment. Federal prosecutors began using the Chagra case as a template for investigating and prosecuting complex conspiracies. The methodical approach, building the case through financial records, cooperating witnesses, recorded conversations, and circumstantial evidence, became a model taught at the FBI Academy and in U.S. attorney training programs. Dozens of subsequent cases employed similar strategies, leading to convictions in organized crime, terrorism, and public corruption investigations. The case also highlighted the value of prison informants and recorded conversations as investigative tools. While some civil liberties advocates raised concerns about the ethics of using inmates to gather evidence against fellow prisoners, courts consistently ruled that such tactics were legal and appropriate when investigating serious crimes. The recordings of Joe Chagra's statements and Charles Harrison's phone call to his ex-wife became textbook examples of how electronic surveillance could provide crucial evidence in cases that might otherwise be impossible to prove. In Phoenix, the Chateau Dijon condominium complex where Judge Wood was killed underwent significant changes over the years. The parking lot was repaved, eliminating the physical traces of the assassination. New residents moved in, most unaware of the building's dark history, but longtime residents remembered, and in 1995, they successfully petitioned to have a memorial plaque installed near the spot where the judge fell. The bronze plaque, mounted on a small granite monument, reads, "In memory of Judge John H. Wood, Jr., United States District Court, Western District of Texas, assassinated May 29, 1980, while serving his country with honor and integrity. His sacrifice reminds us that the rule of law is worth defending, and that those who dedicate their lives to justice deserve our eternal gratitude." The monument became a quiet place of reflection, visited occasionally by law students, legal historians, and people interested in true crime history. Some visitors left flowers, others simply stood silently, contemplating the spot where an ordinary morning turned into a moment of historical significance. In San Antonio, the federal courthouse where Judge Wood had presided over countless trials was renamed the John H. Wood, Jr. Federal Courthouse in 1987. The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, federal judges from across the country, Justice Department officials, FBI agents who'd worked the investigation, prosecutors who'd tried the case, and members of the Wood family. Attorney General Edwin Meese delivered the keynote address, emphasizing the importance of protecting the judiciary and honoring those who'd given their lives in service to justice. Judge Wood was murdered because he refused to compromise his principles, Meese said. He knew that drug traffickers feared him, that they wanted him removed from the bench, that they might try to harm him, but he continued doing his job with the same dedication and integrity he'd always shown. His courage in the face of threats, and his ultimate sacrifice, embody the best traditions of the American judiciary. The courthouse's main courtroom was preserved as closely as possible to how it looked during Judge Wood's tenure. His nameplate remained on the bench, photographs of him hung in the hallways, New judges who were assigned to the courthouse were given tours that included information about Judge Wood's career and his assassination, reminding them of the risks inherent in their positions and the importance of maintaining judicial independence. Law schools across the United States incorporated the case into their curricula. Criminal law professors used it to teach conspiracy law, particularly the concept that conspirators need not be present at the scene of a crime to be guilty of murder. Constitutional law classes examined the case in discussions about judicial independence and the separation of powers. Legal ethics courses analyzed the defense attorney's obligations when representing clients accused of murdering judges. True crime writers produced multiple books about the assassination. The most comprehensive, published in 1998, was titled Maximum John: The Assassination of a Federal Judge and the Conspiracy That Shocked America. The author spent 5 years researching, conducting interviews with investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, family members, and even corresponding with Joe Chagra in prison. The book provided detailed insights into the personalities involved, the investigation's challenges, and the trial's dramatic moments. Television documentaries followed, including a 2-hour special on a major cable network in 2005, the 25th anniversary of the murder. The program featured interviews with Catherine Brennan, now a federal judge herself, and Robert Mitchell, retired from the FBI. Both reflected on the case's significance and the lessons they'd learned. "It was the defining case of my career," Brennan said in the documentary. "Nothing I've worked on before or since compares to the stakes involved. We weren't just prosecuting 3 criminals. We were defending the principle that the judiciary cannot be intimidated by violence. If we'd failed to get convictions, it would have sent a terrible message to every criminal in America. Kill a judge, and you might get away with it." Mitchell emphasized the investigation's complexity. People think solving crimes is like television, where brilliant detectives have sudden insights that crack the case. The reality is much more mundane. It's thousands of hours of work, reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses, following dead ends, gradually building evidence until you have enough to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The Judge Wood case took 18 months from murder to arrest, and every day of that time someone was working the investigation. The case also became a reference point for discussions about judicial security and the proper balance between accessibility and protection. Federal judges, by tradition and necessity, were supposed to be accessible to the public. They lived in ordinary neighborhoods, shopped at regular stores, attended community events. But Judge Wood's assassination demonstrated the risks of such accessibility. In the decades following the murder, the U.S. Marshals Service developed sophisticated threat assessment protocols. Judges who presided over high-profile cases, terrorism trials, organized crime prosecutions, major drug trafficking cases, received enhanced security, including protective details, home security systems, and secure transportation. Some judges resisted, arguing that excessive security created distance between the judiciary and the public. But most accepted the new reality. Serving on the federal bench in the modern era required acknowledging and mitigating security risks. The Drug Enforcement Administration also drew lessons from the case. The fact that a major trafficker like James Chagra had felt so threatened by a single judge that he'd ordered an assassination suggested that harsh sentencing did indeed function as a deterrent, even if it occasionally provoked violent responses. DEA officials testified before Congress that the Chagra case demonstrated the importance of protecting judges who took aggressive stances against drug trafficking. However, some criminal justice reform advocates drew different conclusions. They argued that the case illustrated the problems with overly harsh sentencing policies. If judges like Wood had been more moderate in their punishments, defendants like Chagra might not have felt desperate enough to resort to murder. The debate continues to this day, with no clear consensus about whether Maximum John's approach to sentencing was justified or counterproductive. In the organized crime community, the case became a cautionary tale. Mob bosses who might have considered targeting judges or prosecutors thought twice after seeing the resources the federal government devoted to solving Judge Wood's murder and the harsh sentences imposed on the conspirators. The message was clear. Attacking the justice system would bring the full weight of law enforcement down on the perpetrators, and conviction would mean spending the rest of life in prison. In 2008, on the 28th anniversary of Judge Wood's death, the Federal Bar Association held a symposium in San Antonio titled Judicial Independence and Security: Lessons from the Wood Assassination. Speakers included federal judges, law enforcement officials, legal scholars, and security experts. They discussed the ongoing challenges of protecting judges while maintaining the openness and accessibility essential to a democratic justice system. One panel focused specifically on the Chagra case, examining what had gone right and wrong in the investigation and prosecution. Former FBI agents described the frustrations of the early months, when leads seemed to go nowhere and the list of potential suspects numbered in the hundreds. Prosecutors explained their strategy for building a conspiracy case based largely on circumstantial evidence and cooperating witnesses. Defense attorneys, not those who'd represented the defendants but others who'd studied the case, critiqued various tactical decisions and discussed whether better defense strategies might have achieved different outcomes. The consensus among participants was that the case had been investigated and prosecuted effectively, that justice had been served, and that the convictions had sent an important message. But speakers also acknowledged the tragedy at the heart of the case. A dedicated public servant had been murdered, families had been destroyed, and the need for judicial security had increased significantly. In the criminal underworld, stories about the Chagra case were passed down through generations. Young drug dealers heard about Maximum John and the trafficker who'd been so afraid of him that he ordered a hit. They heard about the massive investigation, the prison informants, the recorded conversations that proved guilt. The stories served as warnings. Federal law enforcement had long memories, sophisticated techniques, and unlimited resources. No matter how careful criminals believed they were, mistakes would be made, evidence would be found, and justice would ultimately prevail. The case also affected how criminal defense attorneys counseled their clients. Lawyers began explicitly warning defendants facing serious charges that attempting to intimidate, threaten, or harm judges or prosecutors would inevitably make their situations worse. They emphasized that the justice system had mechanisms for appealing convictions and challenging sentences, but that violence was never an acceptable option and would only guarantee the harshest possible punishment. Elizabeth Chagra, Jimmy's ex-wife, lived until 2015, dying at age 73. She never accepted her former husband's guilt, maintaining until her death that he'd been framed by a corrupt justice system desperate to solve a high-profile case. She refused interview requests from journalists and documentary producers, wanting only to live quietly and avoid the media attention that had plagued her family for decades. Her children, she and Jimmy had 3, struggled to build normal lives under the weight of their father's notoriety. They changed their last names, moved to different cities, and tried to distance themselves from the Chagra legacy. In a rare interview given anonymously to a journalist in 2012, one of Jimmy's daughters described the challenges of growing up as the child of a convicted murderer. "People would find out who my father was, and suddenly I was treated differently," she said. "Teachers looked at me with suspicion. Other kids' parents didn't want me in their homes. I felt like I was being punished for something I didn't do, something I had no control over. I was 7 years old when he was arrested. I barely remember him outside of prison visiting rooms. My entire childhood was defined by his crime." Terry Richards, the cooperating witness whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, entered the Federal Witness Protection Program after the trial. He was given a new identity and relocated to an undisclosed location. Despite his cooperation, he still served 5 years in federal prison on his own drug charges, though his sentence was substantially reduced from what he would have received without cooperating. After his release, Richards disappeared into anonymity. The Marshal's Service, which administered the Witness Protection Program, refused to provide any information about his whereabouts or current status. Whether he successfully rebuilt his life or returned to criminal activities remains unknown. Jerry Thompson, the prison informant who'd recorded Joe Chagra's incriminating statements, also received benefits for his cooperation. His sentence was reduced, and he was transferred to a lower security facility. He was released from federal custody in 1989 and lived quietly until his death in 2003. In an interview shortly before his death, Thompson expressed ambivalence about his role in the case. "I helped catch some bad guys, and I got a reduced sentence for it," Thompson said. "But I also betrayed someone's trust, even if that person was a criminal. Joe Chagra thought I was his friend, and I was secretly recording everything he said. I'm not proud of that, even though I understand why it was necessary. It's complicated." The physical evidence from the case, the shell casing, the financial records, the recorded tapes, was preserved in FBI archives. The Weatherby Mark V rifle used to kill Judge Wood was never recovered, despite extensive searches of the Arizona desert and multiple leads over the years. Investigators believed Harrison had disassembled it and disposed of the parts in various locations, making recovery impossible. In 2019, the FBI released a detailed report on the investigation, declassifying documents that had been sealed for decades. The report provided fascinating insights into the investigative process, including several promising leads that ultimately went nowhere, witness statements that proved unreliable, and theories about the crime that were eventually disproven. One particularly interesting revelation was that investigators had initially suspected multiple potential conspiracies. Some agents believed the assassination might have been ordered by a drug cartel worried about Judge Wood's aggressive approach to narcotics cases. Others thought it might have been connected to organized crime, possibly a mob contract carried out to send a message to other judges. Only after months of investigation did the evidence clearly point toward James Chagra as the person who'd ordered the hit. The report also revealed that Charles Harrison had been under FBI surveillance for unrelated crimes at the time he was planning Judge Wood's murder. Agents had been watching him for potential involvement in a series of armed robberies in the Dallas area. They'd documented his trip to Phoenix but hadn't understood its significance until after the assassination. In hindsight, the surveillance reports showed Harrison conducting reconnaissance on Judge Wood's condominium in early May, though agents hadn't realized what they were witnessing at the time. This revelation sparked criticism of the FBI for failing to prevent the assassination. If agents had been watching Harrison more closely, if they'd understood what he was planning, Judge Wood might still be alive. The FBI defended itself by noting that Harrison was one of hundreds of criminals under surveillance at any given time, that agents couldn't possibly predict every crime that might be committed, and that even with the benefit of hindsight, the surveillance reports didn't clearly indicate Harrison's intentions. The debate raised broader questions about preventive law enforcement. How much surveillance is appropriate? What level of suspicion justifies intensive monitoring? How can agencies balance public safety with civil liberties and practical resource constraints? These questions remain contentious, with no easy answers. In the legal community, Judge Wood's reputation evolved over the years. Some continued to view him as a hero, a judge who stood firm against criminals and paid the ultimate price for his courage. Others developed more nuanced perspectives, acknowledging his dedication while questioning whether his sentencing approach had been optimal. The evolution of criminal justice philosophy, with increasing emphasis on rehabilitation, drug treatment, and alternatives to incarceration, led some observers to view Maximum John's harsh sentences as products of their time, reflective of the tough-on-crime mentality that dominated the 1970s and 80s. But regardless of debates about sentencing philosophy, no one disputed that Judge Wood had been a man of integrity who deserved protection rather than assassination. His murder remained the single most brazen attack on the federal judiciary in American history, a crime that shocked the nation and prompted lasting reforms. The story of Judge John Howard Wood, Jr., the man called Maximum John, is ultimately a story about the rule of law and the price sometimes paid to uphold it. He was a judge who believed that serious crimes deserved serious punishment, who refused to show mercy to drug traffickers destroying communities, who maintained his principles even when they made him a target. His assassination was meant to intimidate the judiciary, to demonstrate that wealth and violence could overcome justice. Instead, it proved the opposite. The massive investigation, the successful prosecution, the harsh sentences imposed on the conspirators, all demonstrated that the justice system, while sometimes slow and imperfect, ultimately prevailed. Judge Wood's sacrifice was not in vain. It strengthened the federal judiciary, led to better security for judges, and sent an unmistakable message. The rule of law is stronger than any individual, and those who attack it will face the full consequences of their actions. On May 29th each year, a small ceremony is held at the memorial in Phoenix, where Judge Wood was killed. Federal judges from the district, U.S. Marshals, FBI agents, and members of the Wood family gather to lay a wreath and remember a man who died doing his job. The ceremony is brief and dignified, without speeches or fanfare. It is simply a moment to honor a fallen servant of justice and to recommit to the principles he embodied. In the John H. Wood, Jr. Federal Courthouse in San Antonio, new judges take their oaths of office beneath a portrait of the man for whom the building is named. They are reminded of his legacy, his dedication, and his ultimate sacrifice. They understand that serving on the federal bench carries both tremendous honor and potential danger. that maintaining judicial independence sometimes requires courage, and that the work they do matters profoundly to the functioning of American democracy. The assassination of Judge John Howard Wood, Jr. on May 29, 1980, remains a defining moment in American legal history. It represents the darkest impulses of criminals who believe they can escape justice through violence. But it also represents the resilience of the legal system, the dedication of law enforcement, and the ultimate triumph of justice over lawlessness. Judge Wood went to work that morning knowing he had enemies, knowing he was hated by some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, but believing that enforcing the law mattered more than personal safety. That belief cost him his life, but it also ensured that his name would be remembered with honor, that his sacrifice would strengthen the institution he served, and that his legacy would endure long after those who killed him were forgotten in their prison cells. Justice was denied in the parking lot of the Chateau Dijon condominium complex on that May morning, but justice was ultimately affirmed through years of investigation, prosecution, and conviction. The courtroom justice that Judge Wood sought to provide was eventually delivered, not in his courtroom, but in the case that bore his name and honored his memory. And that perhaps is the most fitting tribute to a man called Maximum John.